The London rain that day was so cold, it felt like it was piercing through my clothes. I stood before the newly dug grave, watching the oak coffin slowly being lowered into the cold, wet earth. Raindrops slid down my face, mingling with the heavy feeling I'd tried to hold back for days. Eleanor Sterling was gone, the woman I'd loved for 50 years. The one who had stood beside me in that small, rented room with only an old wooden table and said we would build something greater than ourselves. I believed her, and Eleanor believed me. But when the last layer of earth covered her resting place, I realized some things are lost, not because of time, but because of greed. Right behind me, our 2 children stood under expensive black umbrellas. Julian, my eldest son, and Sophia, my only daughter, the 2 children I once held in my arms, the 2 children Eleanor once said would be the most beautiful legacy we would leave to the world. But that day, at their own mother's funeral, the only thing they cared about wasn't the woman lying beneath the earth. Julian bowed his head, looking at his phone, not to read the last messages for his mother, not to look at family photos. His phone screen displayed the stock price of Sterling Biotech, the corporation Eleanor had spent almost her entire life building, a corporation worth $50 million. Each time the number changed, Julian's finger glided lightly across the screen. He calculated, monitored, and analyzed right beside the grave of the woman who had created everything he was about to receive. Sophia stood a few steps away. She didn't look down at her mother's grave either. She was speaking softly to Marcus, her husband, about the mansion in Chelsea. I heard a few words amidst the rain. The back of the house, the garden, the infinity pool. Just hours after sending Eleanor to her final resting place, my children had begun planning changes to the house she loved most. I stood among them. But no one saw me. At 75, I had become a ghost in my own family. After the funeral, everyone returned to Chelsea Manor. That house had once been Eleanor's happiest place. It wasn't just a multi-million-pound property. For her, it was a record of our entire journey. The wooden staircase in the main hall was where Eleanor used to wait for me every evening when I returned from my research lab. The library in the east was where she read her first books on biotechnology before founding her company, and the rose garden behind the house was where she personally planted each rose bush. Eleanor once said that when everything outside became too noisy, she only needed to step out into that garden to remember who she was. But that evening, Julian walked into the library with a glass of Chateau Margaux in his hand, a bottle Eleanor had kept for years. I remember her saying she would open it on the day the whole family could sit together after the company was completely settled. That day never came, and now it wasn't Eleanor who opened it. It was her son. Julian sat amidst the antique bookshelves, the manuscripts his mother had once cherished, and spoke to clients on the phone about plans to modernize the room. According to him, the library was too old. Such a space would be more suitable as an art gallery for VIP clients. I stood at the door. No one asked my opinion. No one remembered that the person who had helped Eleanor choose every single paving stone in this room was still standing right there. Sophia went even further. She and Marcus walked around the garden with a 3D scanner. Their footsteps trod the flower beds Eleanor had tended for decades. The device beeped softly as they measured distances. Wart, all in preparation for demolition. The rose garden would disappear. In its place would be a glass pool overlooking London. Sophia looked at the blueprints on the tablet with satisfaction. She didn't see the roses. She didn't see her mother's hands, once covered in dirt every morning. She only saw the value of the land beneath her feet. I stood by the back window of the house. A rose branch Eleanor had planted in her last year swayed gently in the rain. I reached out and touched it. It was the only thing in this house that remembered she had once existed. In Julian and Sophia's eyes, I was just an old man living off their mother's fortune. They forgot that before Sterling Biotech, before the Chelsea mansion, before the luxury cars and apartments in Zurich, there was only Eleanor and me, Two young people with a dream that almost no one believed in. 45 years ago, Eleanor had an idea for a new biotechnology, a technology that could change how many diseases are treated. But an idea wasn't enough to build a company. It needed capital. It needed a laboratory. It needed millions of things that we didn't have. At that time, I had one thing, a patent that I spent nearly 10 years developing, a technology that many large companies wanted to buy. I could sell it for millions of dollars. I could be named on every contract. I could be mentioned in future articles, but I knew Eleanor had the ability to make it bigger. So I sold it. I used all the money to save Eleanor's family company from the brink of bankruptcy. Then, I did something that very few people understand. I erased my name from important records, not because I didn't want recognition, because I wanted Eleanor to have a chance to stand in the light. I wanted the world to know her, not the shadow behind her. For 45 years, I never regretted that decision. Until the day my children looked at me like a stranger. They looked at the man who had sacrificed his entire career to build the foundation for this family, and saw only a useless old man. A high-class gardener lucky enough to marry the queen of the tech industry. They didn't know that Eleanor never forgot. They didn't know that before she left, she had prepared something hidden in the old leather briefcase she left me. A briefcase that Julian scoffed at when he saw it. An item they thought was just a worthless memento. But inside it wasn't old letters, not family photos, but the biggest secret Eleanor ever kept. And when I opened it, I realized that my children hadn't just made one mistake. They had just opened the door to their own downfall. I used to think the most painful day of my life was the day Eleanor left me. I was wrong. The most painful day was the day I realized that the children we had spent our lives protecting were the first to want to take away everything I had left. 3 days after the funeral, the family lawyer asked everyone to gather in the east study of the Chelsea mansion to read the will. That room had once been Eleanor's workspace for important decisions. The walnut desk still bore the small scratches from her years of use. A photograph of the company's first investment still hung on the wall. I sat in my usual spot, the chair to the left of the desk, where I used to sit with Eleanor to review the company's first reports. But that day, I felt like a guest who had been mistakenly invited into this room. Julian sat opposite me in a tailored black suit. He didn't seem sad. He didn't seem mournful. He just seemed impatient. Sophia sat next to Marcus. In her hand was the latest model phone, constantly flashing with messages from the real estate agent. Even during her mother's will reading, they were still preparing for life after receiving the inheritance. Lawyer Holloway placed the file on the table. He had worked with Eleanor for over 30 years, a silver-haired, taciturn man, always appearing in a dark suit, and with the sharp eyes of someone who had seen too many inheritance disputes. He opened the first page. His voice echoed in the quiet room. Eleanor Sterling's assets included ownership of shares in Sterling Biotech, international real estate, an apartment in Zurich, financial investments, and many other assets. I looked at Julian. He sat up straighter. So did Sophia. The two children were waiting for the moment they thought they deserved. And then that moment arrived, entire ownership of the corporation. Investment accounts, luxury apartments, a fleet of luxury cars, all divided between Julian and Sophia's. The atmosphere in the room changed. Julian smiled slightly. Sophia looked at Marcus with a satisfied expression. They had received what they had been waiting for, an empire, a name, a life that many could only dream of. I sat still, not surprised, because I knew Eleanor. I knew she never made important decisions hastily. But when Holloway turned to the last page, Julian and Sophia's expressions changed. My name appeared, but not with shares, not with real estate, not with any large sums of money. I received an old leather briefcase, that's all. A worn brown leather briefcase, frayed at the corners. The briefcase Eleanor used to carry during the early years of building the company. The room was silent for a few seconds. Then Julian chuckled. not loudly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. He looked at the briefcase on the table, then at me. I thought at least you should have left Dad something suitable. I didn't reply. Julian leaned back in his chair. That's true of Dad, old things. Sophia chuckled softly. She didn't look at me. She only looked at her phone screen, which was probably displaying new plans for the mansion. I looked at the leather briefcase in front of me. I'd seen it next to Eleanor in thousands of meetings. I'd seen her carry it through the days when the company was on the verge of collapse. To me, it wasn't old. It was a part of our lives. But in the eyes of my children, it was just a worthless object. Holloway continued reading the last part. No more assets were transferred to me. No control, no shares, no large sum of money. Julian looked at me as if wanting confirmation of something. That his father really had nothing left. That the man who once stood beside Eleanor was now just an old man with no assets in his name. Sophia was the next to speak. She said that I was still their father, after all. So they would support me. A $2,000 allowance per month. It sounded generous. But the conditions were what made me understand everything. I had to leave the Chelsea mansion within 48 hours. The house was up for sale. A Middle Eastern oil billionaire had made an offer to buy it. Sophia said the house was too big for someone my age, someone no longer capable of managing assets. I listened to every word, no objection, no anger, because sometimes silence is the only way to see a person's true nature. I looked at my two children. They weren't chasing away a stranger. They were chasing away their own father. The man who had stayed up many nights when they had fevers. The man who gave up his career so their mother could stand on stage receiving awards. The man who spent his life building the foundation upon which they now stand. But in their eyes, I was just an expense to be discarded. 2 days later, I packed my things. Not much. At 75, after half a century of marriage, I realized that a person can live with less than they think. I took a few clothes, an old watch, my wedding photo with Eleanor, and the leather briefcase she left behind. I didn't take anything expensive, because most of the valuable things in that house never belonged to me. They belonged to Eleanor. I walked down the hallway one last time. I walked past the library. I walked past the living room. I walked past the rose garden. The roses Eleanor planted were still in bloom. I wonder if they understand that their caregiver is about to leave. When I reached the front door, Julian was standing in the hall. He looked at the small suitcase in my hand. No apology, no question. Just a look as if he had just finished what he needed to do. I walked out. The Chelsea mansion door closed behind me. The sound was very soft, but to me it felt like the end of 50 years of my life. That night, I went to a small inn on the outskirts of London. The room was just big enough for a single bed, an old wooden table, and a weak yellow lamp. The walls smelled musty. The windows weren't completely closed. The sound of cars outside echoed in all night. I placed Eleanor's leather briefcase on the table, the only thing she left me. I looked at it for a long time. Then, for the first time since leaving the mansion, I unlocked it. The lock on the leather briefcase made a very faint click. But in that quiet boarding house, the sound echoed strangely clearly. I had once thought it was just an item Eleanor had left behind because of old memories. A briefcase she carried in her early days of starting her business. A memento of a time when we had nothing but dreams and the recklessness of youth. I never thought it contained something that could completely change my life. There was no money inside the briefcase, no jewelry, no property documents that Julian and Sophia were hunting for. Only a few neatly arranged files, a handwritten letter from Eleanor, and a small, palm-sized black metal box. I recognized the box immediately. It didn't resemble any ordinary storage device I had ever seen. No connection ports, no alphanumeric password. There was only a small sensor area in the middle. A fingerprint. I sat down on the wooden chair next to the table. My hands began to tremble, not because of age, but because of a strange premonition. Eleanor never did anything without reason. If she had hidden this in her briefcase and only left it for me, she surely knew today would happen. I placed my finger on the sensor. A faint blue light flicked on. The device recognized me. The small screen next to it lit up. A single folder appeared. "4. Arthur," I pressed open. A video began to play, and then I saw Eleanor. She was sitting in her old study. Not the luxurious room upstairs in the Chelsea mansion, but our first study, decades ago. Behind her were old filing cabinets, faded blueprints, and the wooden desk I had built for her myself. Eleanor looked much weaker than the last time I saw her, but her eyes were the same, calm, sharp, and full of love. She knew what her children would do. That was the first thing Eleanor said in the video. Not because she hated them, but because she understood them. She had seen Julian and Sophia change little by little as power emerged. She saw how they began to see everything in terms of money. The house was no longer a place of memories. It was real estate. The company was no longer a dream. It was an asset to be exploited. And the father who had sacrificed his whole life for the family was now just an expense. I sat motionless in front of the screen. Every word Eleanor spoke pulled me back to the years I thought I had forgotten. She said she had prepared a final layer of protection, a legal fortress that no one but I knew about. Not to take revenge on her children, but to protect something they didn't understand, the true legacy. I opened the files in the briefcase. The first page captivated me. The Sterling Crown Trust. The trust was established secretly many years ago. The founder, Eleanor Sterling, the core beneficiary, Arthur Sterling. I read each line. The more I read, the more I realized that what Julian and Sophia received at the will reading was only the tip of the iceberg. They didn't inherit the entire Sterling empire. They only received the operating rights, the outer shell, the offices, the brands, the active contracts. But what truly created the value of the corporation lied elsewhere. 15 core patents, the foundational technologies upon which all of Sterling Biotech relied. The ownership of the land where the headquarters are located, the most important intellectual property, all of it had been transferred to the trust by Eleanor. I sat there speechless. For years, I thought I had vanished from the company's history. I thought erasing my name from the records meant I was no longer involved. But Eleanor never forgot. She was just waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. I continued reading, and then I saw the number that made me stop. An account outside the corporation's normal operating system. A reserve fund Eleanor had accumulated over the years. Balance, $250 million USD. I had to read it 3 times. $250 million. Not 50 million, as everyone knew. Not the numbers Julian and Sophia were dividing in that luxurious room, but the true value of the Sterling Empire, a number even my children didn't know. I sat in my small rented room. Outside the window was the pale yellow light of the suburban street. On one side was an old bed, a rickety wooden table, and a cheap teapot. On the other side was wealth enough to change the lives of hundreds of people. But the only thing I felt at that moment wasn't wealth. It was pain, because I knew Eleanor had prepared all of this in silence. Perhaps she knew that one day I would need it, not to become rich, but to avoid being trampled on by those she loved most when she lost power. I watched Eleanor's last video again. Before the screen went black, she looked straight into the camera, as if looking directly at me. She said she was sorry for letting me go through that day. Sorry for letting her children say things no one deserved to hear from their own children. But she also said something else. That she never saw me as someone behind her. She saw me as the reason she could move forward. I switched off the device. The room fell silent again. But this time, I was no longer the 75-year-old man kicked out of his home. I was still Arthur Sterling, the man who laid the first foundations of this empire, the man my children thought had been removed from the game. I looked at the phone on the table. A series of unread messages from Julian and Sophia appeared. Reminders that I should sign the waiver, urging me to accept the $2,000 monthly allowance. Reminders that I should know my place, I read them all. Then I put the phone down, for the first time in years. I smiled, not because of victory, but because I knew. They still didn't understand what they had just done home. They had taken the house. They took away my honor. They took away the last years I should have spent peacefully with Eleanor. But they didn't know one thing. In this game, they had just handed me the power to decide. I wasn't in a hurry to return to Chelsea Mansion. Neither was I calling Julian or Sophia to tell them I knew everything. An angry person would want to prove immediately that they had been disrespected. But Eleanor was never one to act on momentary emotions. She always told me that in business, the winner isn't the one who strikes the hardest blow, but the one who understands how dangerously their opponent is putting themselves. And at that moment, I didn't need to do anything, because Julian and Sophia were destroying everything faster than anyone else could. 3 days after I left the mansion, my old phone stopped receiving calls. It only received notifications. A notification from the bank. A notification from the insurance company. And finally, a short email from the family's finance department. All the secondary credit cards in my name had been deactivated. Julian had ordered the closure of all the accounts Eleanor had previously maintained for my use. A small act, but it said a lot. It didn't just want me to leave the mansion. It wanted me to understand that, in his eyes, I no longer had any power. I sat in my small apartment, staring at the bank card lying on the table, a thin piece of plastic, but behind it was a clear message from my son. Dad, you no longer belong in our world. I put the card down, not angry, not disappointed, simply remembering, because sometimes a person's arrogance is the strongest evidence against them. That evening, I called the only person Eleanor had ever trusted completely after me, Mr. Holloway. For over 30 years, Holloway had been Eleanor's personal lawyer. He had handled Sterling Biotech's biggest deals, multi-million-dollar negotiations, and legal battles that no one outside knew about. But what made me trust him wasn't the files. It was something simple. Eleanor never called him lawyer. She called him protector. The meeting took place in a small office at the back of a quiet London street. Holloway looked older than the last time I saw him, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. When I placed Eleanor's hard drive on the table, he showed no surprise. He was silent for a few seconds. Then he opened a cabinet behind him and took out a stack of files. He said that Eleanor had been preparing for this day for a long time. Not because she wanted her children to fail, but because she knew how quickly power could change a person. Holloway opened each document, and what he said next made me realize that the situation was more serious than I thought. Julian and Sophia weren't just spending money from the corporation. They were spending things they didn't really own. After taking over Sterling Biotech, Julian immediately began expanding his life. He hired a team of personal advisors, changed cars, bought new apartments, thrown parties for investors. But the most dangerous thing was the deal he was preparing. Julian wanted to acquire a smaller biotechnology company to expand his empire. The problem was, the deal was worth nearly $100 million. And to secure that loan, he used Sterling Biotech's headquarters building as collateral. Holloway pushed the file toward me. Inside was a copy of the loan agreement. I looked at Julian's signature. He had used something he didn't fully own to borrow a huge sum of money. He thought he was controlling the entire empire. But he didn't know that the foundations of that empire had been moved elsewhere years ago. And Sophia, my daughter, didn't directly run the company, but she was living as if money would never run out. One of the documents Holloway showed me was a contract for the purchase of a private jet. Value $15 million. Sophia signed the contract just days after inheriting the estate. She wanted a private jet for convenient travel between London, Zurich, and New York. I looked at the contract for a long time. Not because of the money, but because of my daughter's absolute confidence. She had never considered the possibility of losing everything, because she had never in her life seen her parents let her fail. Eleanor always shielded them, so did I. But this time, no one was standing behind them anymore. I asked Holloway what we needed to do. He didn't answer immediately. He opened another file. Inside was a list of financial obligations that Sterling Biotech still had to fulfill to the Sterling Crown Trust, royalties, technology usage fees, patent exploitation rights. All the things Julian and Sophia had never known about. For years, Eleanor hadn't collected those payments. She let them accumulate, not to get rich, but to protect the company from its own heirs. I looked at the numbers on the paper. A huge debt was silently building up, and Julian was completely unaware. Holloway looked at me. He asked if I wanted to use my legal rights. I didn't answer immediately. I thought of Eleanor, thinking of the day she was in the hospital, thinking of how Julian and Sophia treated me right after she passed away. I didn't want to destroy what Eleanor had built, but I also couldn't let those who had disregarded it continue to destroy her legacy. I told Holloway to prepare the first step. No lawsuit, no public announcement, not yet. We'll send a reminder. A reminder small enough for Julian to think it could be ignored, but strong enough to make those who understand the law start to worry. A week later, a legal document arrived at Sterling Biotech headquarters. The sender wasn't Arthur Sterling, not the Sterling Crown Trust, but an independent law firm representing an intellectual property rights holder. Payment request, 25 million USD in overdue royalties. Reason, unauthorized use of technology owned by the trust, breach of intellectual property, exploitation agreement. I knew, when Julian saw that letter, he'd laugh. I knew he'd think it was just an administrative error, a matter his lawyers could handle, and that's exactly what I wanted, because a person is most dangerously submerged in water. At the moment, they still think they are standing on solid ground. That evening, I sat in my small boarding house. Eleanor's leather briefcase was still on the table. I placed my hand on it. 45 years ago, I had given Eleanor everything I had to help her build this empire. Now, for the first time in so many years, I was reclaiming its protection. Julian received the legal notice one Monday morning. I knew it through Holloway, not because we were following my son, but because his reaction had quickly become news in London's financial circles. Sterling Biotech was then still considered one of the most promising companies in the biotechnology industry. Investors looked at the name Sterling and saw the history of success Eleanor had left behind. They didn't see the cracks beginning to appear beneath that glossy surface. Julian walked into the boardroom with the air of someone who thought he was in control. On the table lay a letter demanding payment of $25 million in royalties, a sum large enough to warrant serious consideration from any board of directors. But Julian only read it for a few minutes before setting it down. He assumed it was a systemic error, a mistake by the legal department. He believed no one could claim money from the corporation his mother left behind, because in his mind, Sterling Biotech belonged to him. He never questioned why. He never read the documents behind it. He only saw the CEO's chair, first-class flights, parties, handshakes with investors. He didn't see the underlying foundation. But the bank was different. The bank didn't care about the Sterling family's reputation. They didn't care that Julian was Eleanor's son. They only looked at the paperwork, and the paperwork started to cause problems. When the bank's property appraisal department checked the ownership of the headquarters building used as collateral for the $100 million loan, they discovered something unusual. The property wasn't entirely under Sterling Biotech's control. The ownership was tied to another legal entity, the Sterling Crown Trust, a name Julian had never heard of, a name Eleanor deliberately kept hidden from everyone. The $100 million loan was suspended, no further disbursement, no final signing. Within days, the people who used to pat Julian on the back at parties were no longer answering the phone as quickly as before. Investors who had once lauded the new era of Sterling began to question it. And Julian still believed it was just a minor setback. He didn't understand that the problem wasn't just a letter. The problem was that all the power it held never truly belonged to it. Sophia reacted differently than her brother. She wasn't angry. She was terrified. The $15 million private jet was scheduled for delivery. The Zurich apartment had been renovated. Payments for their new lifestyle had begun. Sophia couldn't accept her image in high society being tarnished. She started looking for an escape. And that's when the two siblings made their biggest mistake. They decided to sell something that didn't belong to them. I knew about the plan before they executed it. Holloway had insider sources. Not Julian and Sophia's operatives, but people who had worked with Eleanor. People who remained loyal to the woman, who built Sterling Biotech from scratch. The information we received was very clear. Julian and Sophia were looking for a private equity firm to sell access to the company's core technology formula. They needed cash immediately. They wanted a large enough sum to pay off debt, continue the acquisition, and maintain their image with investors. But what they didn't know was that the investment firm they contacted was a company controlled by me and Holloway, not to trick them, but to let them tell the truth themselves. The meeting was arranged in a private office in London. I didn't show up. I let Holloway represent me. He didn't need to force Julian. He just needed to put the documents in front of him to sign. A greedy person doesn't usually need to be pushed. They come forward on their own. Julian brought his familiar confidence. He talked about Sterling Biotech as if he had built it all himself. He talked about the future, about expansion, regarding the company's need for new capital to move to the next phase. Not once did it mention Eleanor. Not once did it mention the people who laid the foundation. Holloway just listened. Then he produced the contract, a contract for the purchase of technology rights. On the surface, it looked like a normal investment agreement. But inside, there were very specific clauses. The seller had to confirm legal ownership of the technology being transferred. The seller had to guarantee that the asset was not under the control of a third party. The seller was liable if there was a dispute over ownership. Julian signed, Sophia signed. No one read it carefully, because in their eyes, this was just a formality to get the money. But that signature was exactly what we needed. When the contract was finalized, Holloway sent all the documents to the legal team. Inside were the words Julian and Sophia had personally confirmed. They admitted to controlling Sterling Biotech's technology assets. They admitted to the right to use them without mentioning the trust fund. They admitted to the decision to transfer the assets without the necessary approval. In other words, they had just signed evidence against themselves. I sat in Holloway's office as he placed the file down in front of me. I didn't feel happy. There was no sense of victory. Only a long silence, because even though Julian and Sophia had done wrong, they were still my children. But then I remembered the day I stood outside the Chelsea mansion. The day I left the house I had helped build with my own hands, carrying my small suitcase. The day Julian looked at me like a stranger. The day Sophia told me that $2,000 a month was a generous amount of help. I closed the file. There are debts that cannot be repaid with money. There are lessons that only come when a person loses something they once thought was unbreakable. 3 days later, Julian sent an invitation to a big gala, a party announcing the new era of Sterling Biotech. It wanted to show investors that everything was fine. It wanted to prove that the recent problems were just rumors. On the elegant black invitation, Julian Sterling's name was printed in the most prominent position. Eleanor's name wasn't there. My name wasn't there. I looked at the invitation on the table. Then I looked at Eleanor's old leather briefcase next to it. I knew it was time, not for revenge, but to end a misunderstanding that had lasted far too long. Julian thought it had removed me from Sterling's story. But he forgot one thing. The person who wrote the first lines of that story is still alive. Julian always loved the spotlight. Since he was a child, he loved being in a place where everyone could see him. When he was in college, He told Eleanor that one day he would make Sterling's name appear in all the world's biggest business magazines. Eleanor just laughed. She always thought ambition was a good thing. But she never thought that one day, that very ambition would make her son forget who had given him the opportunity. The gala was held at a luxurious hotel in central London. A multi-story glass building, frequented by wealthy businessmen, investors, and the media. Julian wanted that night to be the moment that marked the birth of the new Sterling era. He wanted people to see a young CEO, a successful heir, a man who had taken over his mother's empire and taken it to new heights. But the only thing Julian didn't know was that the creator of that empire was also in the room. I prepared for that evening for a long time. Not because I needed to impress. I had spent most of my life behind Eleanor. I wasn't used to the spotlight, but this time I couldn't appear as the old man kicked out of his house. I wore a tailored suit from Savile Row, not to prove I was rich, but to remind everyone that there are things that cannot be taken away by a will, honor, memories. And a person's true place. Holloway went with me. He carried a black briefcase. Inside were things Julian never thought he'd see: the Sterling Crown Trust contract, patent ownership records, proof of asset transfer, and most importantly, a confession that Julian himself had signed. When I walked into the hotel lobby, no one recognized me immediately. That didn't surprise me. For years, I'd been used to people only seeing Eleanor Sterling. No one remembered the man who always stood behind her. But then a few older people in the industry recognized me. People who had worked with Eleanor from the beginning. They stopped, looked at me. Then their expressions changed. Some bowed. Some simply placed their hands on my shoulder in silence. They remembered, they knew. They had never forgotten that Sterling Biotech wasn't built solely on money. It was built with the sacrifices of people history often overlooks. On stage, Julian was speaking. Behind him was a large screen displaying the Sterling Biotech logo. He spoke of the future, of innovation, of continuing Eleanor's legacy. The words were beautiful. The statements were perfectly suited for a launch. But I knew there was a truth that everyone in this room didn't know. Julian was standing on foundations he didn't own. He was proud of a house for which he had no key. When the speech ended, applause erupted. Julian smiled. He thought he had won. That was the moment I stepped forward. Initially, security approached. They didn't know who I was. They just saw an older man walking toward the stage during the event. But before they could touch me, Holloway stepped up. He didn't raise his voice. There was no need to. He simply presented a stack of papers with legal seals, a temporary freeze order on assets involved in a property dispute. The entire stage area instantly changed. The security guards stopped. The investors began looking at each other. Julian looked down from the stage, and, for the first time in months, I saw the confidence on his face disappear. I stepped onto the stage, not quickly, not in a hurry. I looked at the room full of people Julian wanted to impress. Then I looked at my son, the man who used to be my greatest pride. I said I wasn't here to destroy Sterling Biotech. I came to protect it. Because there are people who think that owning a name means owning everything behind that name. But they're wrong. I asked the screen behind me to switch to the video. Eleanor had left. The whole room fell silent. Eleanor's face appeared on the large screen. The woman everyone in the room once respected. She spoke about the true origins of Sterling Biotech, about the first patents, about the man who stood behind her, about why the Sterling Crown Trust was created, not to seize, but to protect. Then, Holloway displayed the contract Julian and Sophia had signed in their attempt to sell the core technology. Each line of text appeared. Each signature, each clause. The room began to murmur. Those with legal knowledge quickly realized the problem. Julian wasn't just mismanaging things. He had used assets not under his ownership. He had signed agreements he wasn't authorized to sign. And he had even validated that with his own signature. Julian stood on the stage, no longer the confident CEO of a few minutes earlier. just a man who realized things were falling apart. He looked at me. Perhaps he was waiting for me to soften my stance, waiting for me. Still the father figure who always stepped up to clean up his messes. But this time, I didn't step up to save him. I announced the final decision. Sterling Biotech is not the personal property of Julian or Sophia. The management rights are transferred to the Sterling Crown Trust. The current board of directors is suspended pending an investigation. All transactions related to core assets are frozen. In other words, the era Julian declared himself to have begun ended on the very night of its launch. I left the stage in silence. There were no cheers, no sense of victory, only a strange relief, because finally Eleanor's legacy was protected. Outside the hotel, it was still raining in London. I stood under the awning, watching the raindrops fall onto the pavement. Holloway stood beside me. He asked if I was satisfied. I looked at the hotel lights behind us, then shook my head. I don't want my children to fail. I just want them to understand that there are things in life that cannot be obtained through inheritance. They cannot be bought with money, and they cannot be kept by arrogance. But, I know, this is not the end yet, because when an empire falls, those who have lived at the top often take the longest time to realize they have fallen. The collapse of Sterling Biotech didn't happen in a day. Great empires rarely disappear in a single sound. They crack from the inside, little by little, like a luxurious building that you only realize is rotting when the last walls begin to crumble. After that gala, the name Sterling no longer appeared in the news as a success story. It appeared as a warning. Banks began freezing loans related to the disputed assets. Investors demanded explanations. The board of directors launched an internal investigation. Those who had stood beside Julian at parties, who had raised a glass to celebrate the new era, now began to look for ways to protect themselves. That's what I've learned after a lifetime in business. When a ship is sailing smoothly, many people want to stand on the deck. But when it begins to sink, everyone will find their own first lifebuoy. Julian lost everything he thought would last forever. The sports car he had just bought was no longer in the villa's garage. The watch worth hundreds of thousands of pounds that he used to show off at parties had disappeared from his wrist. His luxury apartment in Zurich was placed on the bank's list of assets to be seized. Even the private office he used to host VIPs was sealed off during the investigation. But what devastated Julian the most wasn't the loss of money. It was the loss of the admiring gaze of those around him. For years, he had believed his value lay in the name Sterling. He thought that simply bearing Eleanor's surname would open any door. He didn't understand that a name only has meaning when the person bearing it is capable of protecting the honor behind that name. Sophia fared no better. Marcus was the first to leave, not because of an argument, not because of a moment of emotion, simply a cold, impersonal decision on paper. The divorce papers were filed less than a week after the legal issues began to surface. Marcus's former business partners also quickly distanced themselves from the Sterling family. No one wanted their name dragged into a multi-million-dollar property dispute. Sophia had imagined living amidst parties, private flights, and homes in various countries. But in the end, all that remained for her were the boxes of personal belongings carried out of the luxurious apartment she once prided herself on. I didn't follow the downfall of my children. I didn't read every newspaper article. I didn't check every number. I didn't throw a party to celebrate. Because deep down, I was still their father. Even though they had forgotten it. Even though they had done things that hurt me. But I was no longer the father I was 10 years ago. I couldn't continue to use love to shield people who would never learn to take responsibility. A week later, I returned to Chelsea Mansion, not as someone who had been evicted, but as someone legally recognized to protect Eleanor's legacy. The house was still the same as the day I left, but something was different. It was quieter. No more sounds of people coming and going for business meetings. No more plans to demolish the rose garden. No more conversations revolving solely around the value of each square meter of land. I went straight to the back of the house. Eleanor's garden was still there. Some of the bushes had withered, a few branches were broken, but most were still alive. Like Eleanor, like things built with true love, they don't easily disappear. I called Eleanor's former gardener back. We began restoring each area. No pool, no design changes, no turning the place into a symbol of wealth. I just wanted it back to what Eleanor loved, a garden where people could sit down and remember who they once were. I don't know how Julian and Sophia found the address. Perhaps they heard I was back at the villa. Perhaps they hoped that their old father was still there. The father would open the door. The father would forgive. The father would give them another lifeline. That afternoon, as I stood on the balcony looking down at the garden, I saw two figures standing outside the gate. I recognized them instantly. But it took me a few seconds to accept that they were the two children I had raised. Julian no longer wore his expensive suit, no longer his luxury watch. Sophie no longer wore the designer clothes she used to wear to events. They stood before the villa gate, no longer looked like heirs, just like two desperate people. The security guard announced that they wanted to see me. I was silent for a few seconds. Then I allowed them into the yard. Julian spoke first. His voice no longer had the confidence of the day the will was read. No longer the arrogance of someone who thought they had everything. He said that things had gone too far. That he had made a mistake. That the family shouldn't end like this. Sophia also asked for my help. She reminded me of the $2,000 a month allowance she had previously offered me. An irony I didn't need to mention. I looked at my two children, then at the mansion behind them. The place that had witnessed so many years of this family. I remembered the day I left, the small suitcase, the old leather briefcase, and the statement that I only needed $2,000 a month to live. I stepped closer to the balcony. My voice wasn't loud, but loud enough for them to hear. The Sterling Bank is closed. They were both silent. I looked at Julian, then at Sophia. There are no more accounts to withdraw from. There are no more assets to divide. There's no one left to clean up the mess for the children. I paused, not because I wanted to hurt them, but because this was the first time in their lives I'd let them stand on their own 2 feet. I told them that if they wanted to know the value of money, they should try earning it with their own labor. If they wanted to understand how Eleanor built everything, they should start where I started, from the days of working when no one knew my name, from the days of sweat for every step forward, from things they'd never experienced. I didn't chase them away in anger. I just closed the door, this time not with an abandoned father, but for a man who had finally regained his peace. In the months that followed, Eleanor's rose garden gradually recovered. New bushes were planted. The old paths were repaired. The wooden chair where Eleanor used to sit and read was put back in its original place. I still kept the old leather briefcase. I never replaced it with a new one because it reminded me that sometimes what others consider worthless is the very thing that holds the most important truth. Eleanor didn't leave me a gift. She left me the opportunity to protect what she had built her whole life. And in the end, her true legacy wasn't in the numbers in the bank account, not in the buildings, not in the patents. It was in the small garden behind the Chelsea mansion, where every morning I still see the roses blooming in the London sun. And remember, there was a woman who trusted me enough to entrust her entire future to me. Eleanor is gone, but what she built lives on.